Harvard Business School, John Quelch.
Good morning, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be back in the kingdom. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. And I'd like to congratulate the GCF on this excellent event, and to thank all the organizers for enabling us to meet once again here in Riyadh. So we have an excellent panel following on Nick's earlier panel. I'm just going to introduce briefly the presenters and our colleagues on stage in the order in which they'll make some opening remarks. So we will hear first of all from, on my left, Jean-Loup Chameau, who came from Stanford to be the president of KAUST, the technology university that is making a lot of waves, a lot of impact in the world of academia. Secondly, we'll hear from an old friend of the GCF, well known in the kingdom, Fadi Handor, who's the founder and vice chairman of Aramex, and now the chairman of WANBA, and very much involved in his own venture capital investing operation. And then thirdly, we'll hear from Roy Jacobs, who is the CEO for Philips of the Middle East and Turkey region. Roy has been in that position for 2 years. Fourth, we have at the end of the row Dr. Tony Raven, who is CEO of the Cambridge Enterprise Limited organization, which is the commercialization arm of technology at Cambridge University in the United Kingdom. And then finally, another repeat presenter at the forum is Professor Dan Eisenberg from Babson in the United States, who's a professor of entrepreneurship there and has just brought out a recent book in his capacity as head of the Entrepreneurship Ecosystem Project at Babson. So we have an excellent panel. We've got about 50 minutes, and I'm going to start the panel with Jean-Loup, because Jean-Loup is, of all of us sitting up here, the one person who is resident in the kingdom. He has been here for 5 months. As I said, he comes from Stanford University, and I think be very interesting to understand his point of view on what the kingdom has to do to extract the most out of technology to build a higher entrepreneurship capacity in the kingdom. So Jean-Loup, could you kick us off, please?
First, thank you. Let me make a correction here. I did not come from Stanford. I received a PhD at Stanford, but I came from Caltech. I was the president of Caltech in California as well before I came here. So
that's almost a criminal mistake that I've made there.
I'm sure there are Stanford alumni here, and they must be very upset.
To us at Harvard, California is just a complete blur.
Yeah. No, you can compare Harvard to Stanford, but Caltech you compare to MIT. Okay, anyway, I had a chance in my career to work in California, in Silicon Valley, in the Los Angeles area. I also worked in the Midwest, in the Chicago area, as well in Atlanta, in university as well as corporate environment. And I've been involved in research as well as in the creation of new enterprises. And in only 1 or 2 minutes, let me tell you just what I view as being the ingredients for success when we talk about innovation, entrepreneurship, and creation of jobs and new activities. And it doesn't matter if it is in a university or if it is within the corporate world, I believe, or within the infrastructure surrounding all that. Ingredients for success are unusual talent. Extraordinary people create extraordinary things. Even at a place like Stanford, let's say, if you go there, you will find that it is a very special group of people who creates a major part of the value. So paying attention to unusual talent, recruiting and mentoring unusual talent is key. commitment to excellence and sustaining excellence in everything you do is key, especially, for instance, looking at universities in science and technology. Commitment to excellence and sustaining that excellence, I think, makes a great difference over time. Another key ingredient for success I have found is to have an enabling and supportive culture. Innovation, entrepreneurship is a messy thing. It's not easy to make it happen. There is no direct route. There is no one path. It is people who are very creative, who are very inventive, people who tend to do things in a somewhat uncontrolled manner. Sometimes I call it organized chaos. And you have to be able, within a university or within the country or within the local environment, to provide, to allow for a messy, but to have an enabling and supportive culture. To have, I call it a disdain for bureaucracy. To enable that culture, you have to make things happen fast. You have to be supportive of people and to be less bureaucratic than maybe we tend to be in any organization. So, to also encourage people to be, in terms of their ideas, especially if they're doing research, to be both driven by curiosity and goals. By curiosity, I mean looking at things that people may feel are not interesting. I'll give you an example. I have a good friend of mine who for several years was interested in finding out how jellyfish move. And I can tell you it was very hard to find research support for that. However, he discovered how jellyfish move, and since then there has been applications and new businesses related to heart valve, the propulsion of submarine, and in a wind energy area. So supporting curiosity-driven ideas is important, as well as goal-driven ideas. That's enough for the time being.
Okay, let me ask you a couple of quick follow-ups. First of all, if we were looking at KAUST 5 years from now or 10 years from now, how would we measure the success of KAUST? Especially in terms of impact on business and entrepreneurship in the kingdom.
The main impact will be to graduate, let's call it produce, young scientists, young engineers who are very well trained to accomplish those goals and be innovative, and people who are going to be driven by innovation. Long term will be the main impact on the kingdom. Then I could give you other examples having to do with creation of new businesses, which we are already doing, as well as some major initiatives related to critical issues in the kingdom and in the Middle East and in the world related to, for instance, water and food production.
Okay, just give us one example.
One example, in real time, I was meeting with a group of people in Dubai yesterday, and there are many people from the kingdom involved, including ministries, looking at a dramatic change in algae-type production in a country to use to reuse water and to produce food.
Okay, all right. So let's move secondly in this quick lightning round to Fadi Handour. So Fadi, as you know, has been operating in the kingdom for 35 years. And I know that from my own experience, having been here for 13 or 14 years every year, we've always been talking about entrepreneurship. But just how much change has actually occurred in terms of the climate for entrepreneurship improving in the kingdom in particular? Fadi, what's your sense of that? How is it easier today for someone to become an entrepreneur, or is it as hard as it ever was?
So we're not going to be politically correct here on this issue. Addressing the issue of entrepreneurship has many aspects to it in the kingdom and outside the kingdom. I was also asked to condense our talk for 1 or 2 minutes. So if we can address the challenges in Saudi Arabia in 1 or 2 minutes, I'd win the Nobel Prize. But look, at the end of the day, the story of entrepreneurship is about jobs. And I think competitiveness is always about jobs and finding good jobs. In every single survey that you can imagine in the Arab world with Arab youth, Gallup global well-being research that they publish every year, they say the most important thing on anybody's mind is always a good job. WEF recently came up with their global agendas thing for their Davos, and their 3 most important items on trends for the future. One is societal tension in the Middle East, they say, and then they talk about income disparity and unemployment. These 3 items relate directly to jobs and wealth creation and job creation. So this is a global issue. I don't think Saudi Arabia differs from anywhere else in the world in that matter. You mean even Spain today has 25 to 30% youth unemployment. So let's not say it's only a Saudi or an Arab problem. It's a global problem, and entrepreneurship is also a global problem, and the challenge of job creation is also a global problem. So let's think of it as a global issue that requires global solutions. In my view, and we've done some recent research with my new organization, which is an entrepreneurship support platform called WAMDA. We went out and surveyed 900 entrepreneurs and experts in 8 countries across the region, including Saudi Arabia. We asked them, what is it that restricts you from scaling? You know, creating jobs is about scaling. You can't be an entrepreneur and not create jobs, and only address the issue from a research and development perspective and not create jobs. That's my view. You need to be practical about it. So, and there's no sexiness or illusion of grandeur of being entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs are out there to create wealth and to create jobs at the same time. And we need to have that dual purpose of financial returns and social returns in our course. So the research says very clearly for us, and I think Saudi Arabia is critical because it is half of the economy of the region. The $2 trillion region, half of it is in Saudi Arabia, and without Saudi Arabia, the region cannot scale. So Saudi Arabia carries a big part of the burden of actually carrying, and I was just telling the minister earlier today that Saudi Arabia actually carries the rest of the region with it. The more it opens up, the more the region can scale. And that's also a paradox, because there is a sense of sometimes some protectionism in Saudi Arabia because you need to protect your jobs. So how do you solve that paradox of bringing in more entrepreneurs into Saudi Arabia while actually creating jobs for Saudis in Saudi Arabia? The research says there are 4 challenges that are critical to entrepreneurs in the region and scaling their businesses. One is talent, which at the core of it is education. So how does talent actually join startups? That's a big challenge. And number 2, is there talent? What is the qualifications of the talent that we have, even in the private sector, so that we can create jobs? The biggest challenge for employers today, by the way, is entry-level jobs. They tell you the kids that are graduating from universities do not have entry-level job skills. Number 2, access to finance. As much as we talk about it, banks only loan 8% of their portfolio to SMEs. And that's region-wide. In the Gulf, it's only 4%. I know it's being addressed in Saudi Arabia, but if you don't give access to capital to SMEs, you're not going to create jobs. Jobs are created in companies that employ less than 100 people. We know that. It is global research. It is not the big companies that create jobs. It's the SMEs that create jobs. If you don't give them access to capital, they're not going to be able to scale, and they're not going to be able to create jobs. Number 3, expanding into new countries. All entrepreneurs across the region tell you we need to be in 2 countries. In 2 countries to be able to build our businesses. Number 1 is Saudi Arabia, and number 2 is the UAE. Without having access to entrepreneurs. This is not about visas for entrepreneurs. This is for entrepreneurial enterprises to come and set up shop and bring their technology and capabilities into other countries. It's critical. It's also paradoxical. And number 4 is selling. It's selling. The biggest challenge for young entrepreneurs or the entrepreneurs that are starting businesses is how do I market my product and how do I make my first sale? There is a big gap in the ability to reach the clientele. That's my 2 minutes.
Okay, let me ask you this, Fadi. That was fantastic. Thank you. What do you see improving? Any of these obstacles, do you see
what I see
do you
improving,
see movement?
The most important thing that I see improving is incredible engagement. There is fantastic engagement from the bureaucracy and the public sector because they know the issues and they know the challenges and they know it's about their jobs also. So everybody's job is at stake today. And I feel more engagement than ever before, not only in Saudi Arabia, but across the region. There is a sense that it can only be solved by a public-private partnership, true partnership. It is not because we're going to find an enlightened minister that allows us to talk from the private sector to the public sector, because we are employers. If you want employees in the private sector, you'd better engage the private sector structurally and in a policy-making capability. So and that engagement is happening. It's in the early stage because there has been historical, not only in Saudi Arabia, historical distrust between public and private sector. Let's call a spade a spade. It's there. We need to break that barrier. I know the Minister of Labor in Saudi Arabia comes from the private sector, and we love that, but we need to engage more with that. And we know the issue and the challenge of employing Saudi Arabians. Look, let me tell you something as a non-Saudi company that operates in Saudi Arabia. There is nothing more that we like to do than employ Saudis. We need them employable, though. So that's the big challenge of connecting the Ministry of Labor with the Ministry of Education so that the contents of our education bring out employable people.
Okay, terrific. We'll come back to Fadi a little bit later. Let's go to Roy, also from the private sector. In terms of your experience in the kingdom, Roy, how do you see the evolution of the public-private interaction? Is the kingdom special in some way? How do you create jobs at Philips? How do you help the kingdom in the work that you do?
I think as Philips, of course, if you think about entrepreneurship, which is very much at the heart of any company to survive, we're doing that for more than 100 years. You talk about innovation, you talk about technology leadership. If you talk about innovation in the kingdom, ultimately you talk about people. We're back to the talent question. You're back to how you support and stimulate research. How do you foster innovation in an open way? At Philips, we believe that true innovation happens if you're very open. And we came from, as Philips, that we needed to invent and innovate ourselves and bring that to the world. By now, we have learned that actually there's a lot out there that we can help bring in a better way to a lot of people. Also, what you need to focus on is that innovation that matters. So ultimately, there's a lot of innovation going on, but what is it that you really need? What are your biggest pain points in the system? Take an example. We are serving the healthcare business and the patients and the healthcare system. There's a huge challenge in the kingdom because there's a vast increase in population happening that does not have access to affordable healthcare. In part, it's infrastructure gap, so we need to have more hospitals, more equipment, but very much, again, is also a very big challenge in the people who run those systems. And how can we team up there? What I've seen, and where I'm very positive, is that the dialogue with the government is increasing very much. I see a very clear vision. The challenge comes in the execution. How do we translate it into all the echelons that need to take this and run with it? So if we have an idea about how we want to run a diagnostic center differently, if we want to go into mobile healthcare, if we want to go in preventive screening, how do you take that idea and bring it to an operating model? And that's, I think, where we actually together have a responsibility to work on that. To work on education, so we take part of education as well as the government does. It's not only a government task. That we take people into our company, but also into other countries to get the knowledge and then bring it back to the kingdom. But also that we listen very well to what the kingdom needs. Ultimately, you need to be locally relevant. And the challenge here, there are global challenges, but you also need to be very locally relevant. So we did research into innovation in the kingdom. And again, something we were very positive about is that there's a huge appetite in the kingdom for adopting innovation to leapfrog, to solve problems. And that is what you need. You need an open culture to adopt innovation. Secondly, there was also said, we don't have enough innovation in the kingdom. So there was a clear gap identified, an innovation gap. So how do we crack and close that gap? And thirdly, there was also quite a clear idea when we did the research under healthcare professionals where the pain points are. So we know where to focus on. We know that there is an appetite for open innovation. We also know there are funds. So then is how do we mobilize around it? How do we really get to tangible projects, to people that can contribute in that field, and then a supportive system? Because it's also very much about the enabling part. So governments and rules and regulation have to help set driving standards, open up, and by doing so, attract competitive innovation. Because it's a competitive game. If you want to attract innovation, you need to look at it in a global scale. So those are some of the themes that we have come about, which makes it very exciting because I think there's a lot of progress that is in the making, but we need to accelerate because we have a time gap in terms of how fast we can move on this versus what we see happening in the day-to-day.
Okay, thanks for these observations. Now you are overseeing not just business here, but also in Turkey. So I want to put you on the spot a little bit for a moment and say, what about Turkey compared to the kingdom? What would be the checklist of positives in Turkey where they're doing things better than the kingdom is, and perhaps are there some areas where the kingdom is doing better than Turkey? Without putting you on the spot, but I think just having the comparison would be helpful for the audience.
Yes, I think from an innovation perspective, I think that Turkey is further ahead from a research bench and university system perspective. So the education is ahead. So there's more talent in Turkey itself. Population is also bigger, so you have a bigger talent pool that you can fall back to. I think there is a catch-up game to do. At the same time, if I look to the amount of students that are currently being put in the system in Saudi, it's huge. But there's a generation gap. They are not ready tomorrow. We have a gap to close in terms of knowledge that we need now. So I think that's a comparison I can take. Both countries are working on public-private partnerships. And both are struggling. In healthcare, for example, in Turkey, there are 16 public-private partnership projects of a scale of 500 to 1 billion each. No single one has been closed yet, whilst we're working on it for 3 years, with very, very strong efforts, private, government, and we're progressing. We have laws being changed, we have funds being put in, and we have consortium being established. The same we also see in Saudi. We see that there is concerted effort where we get together and work on solutions. But I think, again, there, the cooperation and the openness, I think something that we see on both sides where there is a challenge.
Okay.
I think from a funds perspective, and that's not unimportant, Saudi is clearly the winner. And that's a huge difference in today's world, because cash is king. If you can fund innovation faster than anybody else, you can take the lead. So from the acceleration perspective and the resourcing to move it ahead, I think Saudi is ahead and should utilize that power to translate that into execution.
Okay, all right. So I think what you're saying, among other excellent points, is that the quality of the higher education system, indeed all education, but the higher education system is critical to technology innovation, which of course is the underpinning for KAUST in the first place. But let's go now with that as a segue to Dr. Raven. Cambridge University, the ecosystem for innovation and entrepreneurship at Cambridge University. How does it work? How could it be helpful here in the Kingdom?
Okay, thank you. And I'd like to sort of caveat everything I'm going to say in that the speakers before me all have extensive experience here of Saudi. This is my first day in the Kingdom, and must thank His Excellency the Governor for his kind invitation to come here. One of the pleas I would make is that countries around the world at the moment are all looking at how do they build their economies and build their economies around entrepreneurship. And that's leading to a lot of top-down strategy to make that happen. I would make a plea for the bottom-up, that most of the things that actually happen and change our society created by entrepreneurs are created against the foresight of activity. So if I can take some examples of that, I think most people would recognize that this has revolutionized our world, the smartphone. It wasn't developed by the mobile phone companies. Mobile phones, which in their days revolutionized our activities, weren't developed by the telephone companies. And across the board, you see these things. If I take us back to the year 2000, most of the things which shape our society today, so smartphones, tablet computing, social media, genetic-based medicine, they nearly all were not things which we would have seen in foresight exercises at the time. And so in the national programs, we clearly have the big challenges which we need to tackle, which entrepreneurs are valuable at doing, and those are things like food security, energy, aging populations, etc. But actually the things which are changing things dramatically have also come not from those directed programs, but just from visionary individuals following ideas that were contrary to what everyone else was thinking at the time. So I would say in our own country, our government has its 8 Great Technologies program. And they've defined the 8 great technologies which they think are going to define the future. My plea to them is we need a 9th great technology, which is the things we haven't thought of before. And that's where our entrepreneurs need to be encouraged. The second part I'd like to make is that in doing this, entrepreneurs these days are globally mobile. And the places that so we have Friedman's flat world where people can go and work anywhere, but we also have at the same time Florida's spiky world, that they actually congregate in the places where the conditions facilitate their activity. And that's why you see that more than half of the entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley are Chinese and Indian, who've gone there because that's the place they see most conducive to their being entrepreneurs. So one of the challenges for any country wanting to do that, and our own country as well, is how do we create those conditions which facilitate them? Now, as Jean-Luc said, entrepreneurship is a messy business. In Cambridge, we call it creative chaos. We don't try and control what's going on, which as an administrator for the process is extremely difficult. As administrators, we like things in nice, neat, straight rows, all the paperwork in order. We like plantations. All the trees are in straight lines so that we can harvest them easily, we can cultivate them easily. What we have in Cambridge is what I call a rainforest. We don't understand it. There are all sorts of weird and wonderful things going on. We are observers and curators of that rainforest, and then suddenly it produces a wonderful bloom or fruit that we get the pleasure of harvesting. And so I would encourage that we don't, as administrators, that we sort of hold back on some of our zeal to make this a nice, convenient one, and recognize the messiness that Jean-Luc mentioned, the creative chaos that we see in Cambridge that drives this whole machine.
Tony, if we think back about 30 years in the United Kingdom, you know, entrepreneurship was a bit of a dirty word at that time. You know, there weren't many role models who were entrepreneurs who would be feted in the best places in London. These days, being an entrepreneur in Britain is something really pretty important and pretty highly regarded. What changed over that period of time? I'm thinking, again, the analogy to the kingdom. What has to happen in terms of the culture, the receptivity to the entrepreneur as a major force for good in society? How did that happen in England?
Well, I think it's still in transition at this stage. There is certainly a much greater awareness of entrepreneurship and its value to the economy, and role models like Richard Branson and others have been very pivotal in making that happen. I think one of the big transitions is actually in the job market, that people used to expect to go and work for a company for life, and that started to evaporate, and people started to realize that a career involved actually many different employers and moving between them, and then recognizing that part of that mobility meant that at some stage they could be self-employed as an entrepreneur, so that developed up. Second part was the government, which came in 1997, very strongly said, we want the country to do this, and they facilitated it and they removed the barriers and encouraged people. They didn't actually prescribe how it was done. They said, we want you to do it. And that led to things like entrepreneurship introduced at schools. So children coming out of schools are starting to think, do I go to university? Do I become an entrepreneur? The same in universities, that entrepreneurship has now become an integral part of the courses, and the impact of your research in societal benefit and economic benefit has become a key measure in the funding of research that universities get.
And I just want to emphasize this because I think that the public-private partnership concept, often we don't really think about higher education as being part of that equation. But higher education is really, in the UK now, very much driven by the concept of what contributions are the universities making to the economy and to the private sector.
Absolutely, and not only in terms of the ideas flowing out from the research base that's created, but also in the students. The amazing statistic which I discovered is that 25% of our graduates from Cambridge don't go and work in the big companies in the city. They go and work in the small entrepreneurial companies around Cambridge.
All right.
And that flow-through is a real change in
I'm going to let Jean-Loup pop in for a second here.
Yes, because when you speak about public-private partnership, the biggest reason of the success of the US since World War II has in fact been because of a public-private partnership between the federal government and the universities. You know, people think of Stanford and MIT and Caltech as private schools. Yes, they're private schools, but 50–60% of their budget is coming from research support, help from the federal government, a private-public partnership, and then which was reinforced about 30 years ago by what's called the Bayh-Dole Act, which really allowed universities and encouraged them and required them to commercialize their ideas. So that's a strong public-private partnership, which was created 60 years ago, and it has worked very, very well.
And is that the model that KAUST is following?
I hope so.
Okay. All right. Now, Dan Eisenberg we have here to reflect on the contributions of the other four panelists and to offer some of his own insights from decades of experience advising entrepreneurs and helping them succeed. Dan, go ahead.
I would add that I was also for 15 years built and ran my own company. So I'm an unusual academic in that respect. I want to pick up, first of all, how many people in the audience would call themselves entrepreneurs? Let me just see your hands. So at least I know how many people are actually awake. That's good. Thank you for
the number will increase as your remarks proceed.
That's right. So I want to pick up, first of all, on a word that Fadi used, which is scale. And there is no entrepreneurship. By the way, I view the world through the lens of entrepreneurship. I have been involved for 30 years. And one thing we might talk about is what's the relationship between innovation and entrepreneurship. It's not quite that clear. But scale, I want to bring up first. And that's in contradiction or contradistinction to the term small business. I've never met an entrepreneur, and I've met thousands, they're written in my book and so on, and not one of them refers to him or herself as a small business. For an entrepreneur, and I think for society, small business is the problem to be solved. Small is the problem to be solved, not the solution. The solution is scaling and growing businesses. And growth in entrepreneurship, at least the aspiration to growth, is what entrepreneurship is about. Jobs are an outcome, not an objective for the entrepreneur. They're a natural outcome of that growth. And so what are the things, some of the key things that drive scale up as opposed to just, and by the way, I think that societally around the world we're much too focused on startup as opposed to scale up. It's very easy most places in the world to start a company compared to how difficult it is to take a company and actually grow it. That's by far the much more difficult challenge anywhere, not just in the kingdom or the Gulf. some of the key elements for scaling up societally and individually. One, you need an excess of talent, employable people. Without that, Fadi didn't say that by accident, that was first on his list in the survey. Everywhere around the world, including Boston, it's top of the list. It's talent. It's not ideas. Second, it's access to markets. And in particular to customers. I think of the people who didn't raise their hands, if I asked how many of you have the potential to purchase goods, services, technology, and so on, the number would be at least as great. It's the access to customers that entrepreneurs need as a resource, not as a favor to the buyer as much as to the seller and the society. And third, this wasn't mentioned, I think it's very important, there has to be what we call in the profession an exit. It's a little bit of a misleading word, but there has to be the ability to realize the gains of one's effort, whether it's through a public stock exchange or a so-called trade sale market. The ability to actually benefit is a very important thing, and I think that's one thing that we have to address in the overall mix of things, because my sense is it's probably lacking. And then my last comment for now has to do with what Jean-Luc said about, and you also, Tony, about this chaos, this messiness, this predictability. If it's predictable, it isn't entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship thrives on unpredictability, and to get that unpredictability, you have to have a little messiness, a little chaos. You have to have talented people being able to do things that other people may think initially are worthless, impossible, and stupid, which, by the way, happens to be the title of my book. I'm going to stop there so we can have more of a discussion, but obviously there's much more to say.
Thanks, Dan. Now, what we're going to do in this session is we're going to open to the floor. So in addition, if you're online following the conference on streaming audio or video, please send in your e-questions as you did with Nick. But in addition, I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions from the floor in a couple of minutes. Get your questions ready. And those of you who have been here before, when I've been sitting in this chair, know that there is the time-honored definition of a question, which is a single sentence that ends with a question mark. And if you feel you are unable to achieve that particular definition operationally, then please do not put up your hand. But we will take 2 or 3 questions in a moment. Now let me go back to Fadi for a second. When you hear all of these good ideas about what can be done, what's necessary to create this climate and culture of entrepreneurship, which of those do you think is the toughest challenge in the kingdom?
I think we need to, I might disagree with Dan a little bit with his last comment. And I've struggled with this over the years. So if entrepreneurship is about Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, we're not going to find many, not in Saudi Arabia, but anywhere else in the world. But if entrepreneurship is brought down to earth a little bit, so that it's not glamorized in the way the West glamorizes it, and make it clearly about creating new businesses that address some pain points in society. You can open a shop and be an entrepreneur at the end of the day that addresses a community-based need. It also can be small. I can understand, and I am the biggest, look, the issue of scaling is essential and clear for tech entrepreneurs and all sorts of entrepreneurs who want to sell. I mean, anybody that starts a business wants to sell more and more and more and more and open more and more markets. But there are also businesses that are community-based businesses that address community issues within a certain restricted geographic environment, and that's okay. Micro-entrepreneurs are micro-entrepreneurs. That's what they are. Microfinance is about single micro-entrepreneurship. It's a big issue. You know, Muhammad Yunus addresses it in many ways, and I think he's one of the greatest Muslim and entrepreneurs in the world. And he's addressed fantastic issues, and there are millions of people that benefit from microfinance. So, the issue of financial and societal interactivity in addressing the solutions has been so intertwined today that it scares me that we only can think about financial returns at a time when crisis, especially after 2008, had shown us how fragile we are as a universe.
Okay. So Dan and Jean-Loup would also like to comment on this, but let me just make a distinction which I think is important that Fadi has made. And it's between what we call technically the traded economy and the non-traded economy. So the traded economy is what you trade outside of your own borders. And the non-traded economy is what's traded within the country. And what Fadi is saying, I think very importantly, is that there is a tremendous amount of benefit to the economy that can come from all of these micro-entrepreneurs and small businesses that are doing good work on behalf of the community in which they are residing. But when we are talking about innovation and technology in a global context, we are then talking about the traded economy, and entrepreneurs need then to be able to scale up, as Dan said, rather than just merely start up. So let me ask Jean-Loup for a quick comment, then Dan, and then we will take our first question. We have time for about 3 questions.
No, you just made my point.
All right, fine. Let Dan?
Well, first of all, I think the areas of agreement between myself and Fadi are much greater than the areas of disagreement. So, but around this micro-enterprise, it's actually very important, and there are lots of ways to discuss this, but I'll just give you one fact. And I don't disagree that micro-business, micro-enterprise doesn't have a place in society. I think it does. Just like lots of things have a place. They're important and they are beneficial. They're not, in my view, entrepreneurship. If you compare Italy, Portugal, Spain, and Greece, they have very high percentages of enterprises fewer than 10 people. The United States, the UK, Germany, and New Zealand have half as many small businesses as do the former. You decide for yourselves which economy you'd like to aspire to.
Okay. Jean-Loup?
Yeah, and I agree with you totally. And also, universities often focus too much on the creation of a company, a startup, and not enough on their growth. Many of the programs, I'm sure Cambridge is not doing that, but my experience at Caltech and Stanford, there is a focus on growing after you have initiated the new business.
Roy?
I think what we're talking about is risk and reward, in essence, which is very critical for entrepreneurship, because there's a barrier to go into it because there is a higher risk perceived, or there is a higher risk which is real. And especially in Saudi Arabia, but also in the Middle East, there is a barrier, an additional barrier in my view, because, for example, government jobs are very attractive to go into.
Yeah.
So to attract people out of the government sector into doing something for themselves, starting it up, which is challenging, tough, you're not clear what you get, versus an attractive as well government job with a clear package, a clear career path, is not an easy choice. So that in itself makes it more challenging to pull people out of that.
And especially if the tradition of social recognition for the entrepreneur's achievements is not yet embedded in the fabric of the culture. Tony, quick one.
I'd just like to pick up on Daniel's point and Fadi's point. We tend to sort of encapsulate this all under the title of an SME. These small companies, some of which are going to be growing very fast, and some of which are going to always be the small little companies that Fadi talks about. There was a review done of that entire sector in the UK, which came to the conclusion that 6% of the SMEs created more than 50% of the economic value for the country. So we need to have all these small companies. They create a lot of employment, but if we're also looking at creating economic value, it is this 6%, this small, scalable, fast-growing corner of the SME market, which we tend not to distinguish in the way we talk about SMEs.
Right.
It is actually the vital part.
Let's just recall, though, at the same time, you need the other 94% to actually enable the 6% to come through, because you don't necessarily know where the 6% are coming from, or can you predict it?
Well, I think you can predict some of it, because some of them you can see are always going to be lifestyle businesses and small operations, but yes, they are important as suppliers, as supporters of the 6%. But if you want to create the economic value, you need to recognize that it is a small proportion of what we call SMEs that can do it. Yeah, and in the States in the last 10 years, similar statistic, it's companies that achieve over $1 billion in sales from a starting zero that create 60% of the new jobs that come from entrepreneurship. So yes, that's a truism, I think, across the board. Now, question. There was a gentleman down here who I noticed earlier. In the front row, if we can get a microphone with due speed. The gentleman on your right, on your left, yeah, right there. Yeah, thanks. Please give us your name, and please keep the question very brief. We only have 3 or 4 minutes left.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Dr. Bashir Al-Ghuraid. I'm interested really what all the speakers have said about creating jobs, but at the end of the day, I did not hear a single one of the dignitaries say, what is a decent living wage? i.e., for every employment, single employer, there need to be a decent living wage. So to create a position, whatever it is in terms of employment, you need to pay them a decent wage according to certain norms within a country rather than across countries. So I just wanted, please, a comment from either or, and thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
Fadi, you've employed
there is a great book called The Coming Jobs War by the ex-CEO of Gallup, and he talks about good jobs and the availability of good jobs, and he says a good job is a job that gets you a steady income on a weekly basis from a steady institution that you work for. Steady, not part-time, a steady job. And then what that level is depending on that country. But steadiness of getting a check at the end of the week is a good job.
Okay, next question.
Basir Al-Gharaini, BMG Financial Group. Since we all agree that SMEs are the backbone of any economy, do you recommend that it should have its own ministry or government banking agency? And if so, from your research, do you recall of any country that has SME as its own government agency?
Anyone in a position to tackle that, Dan?
It's very complicated. Part of it is what you define as SME, because some of the research that Tony and others cite, it's 500 people and below. So first of all, I think we have to be clear about what we're talking about. Secondly, my concern about use of the word S, the small world, is that it doesn't infuse entrepreneurs with inspiration and ambition. It dampens it. And I think that if small business is the backbone of your society, then you need a chiropractor. You need a plethora, a variety of businesses, dynamic, mobility, changing, that includes micro, small, growing rapidly, large, decaying, all kinds. You need that mobility. The jobs then take care of themselves, by the way.
If you'll allow me to add just one point, I think it's the lobbyists from the private sector, if we want to call them that, the people that have access to power and to institutions, should use their capabilities to lobby for an activity for SMEs and micro businesses in society also. So it's not, you can't separate a ministry and say here's, because economy should be an integrated and the systems thinking economy at the end of the day. But to enable access for SMEs so that they address their issues, it's the big business people that need to open the doors for them. That's my view.
Next question in the front, please.
Thank you. My name is Haytham Al-Tayyif. My question to Mr. Fadi. You complain about that banks do not finance entrepreneurs, right? 4% only in Gulf region. At the same time, you admit that most of the people who graduate from university, they don't have the skills for entry-level job. Okay, so for sure the banks will be afraid to finance them. In your vision, do you envisage a short-term solution?
I don't think they're not compatible with each other. I mean, the fact that employability level jobs are a challenge does not mean that you don't have entrepreneurship at the same time and people that are going out and establishing businesses. It is, how do you access finance from banks? Banks are by definition a bit conservative in the way they address things, and they're more scared in giving finance to small, again, the word small, or to startups, let's call it. Let me give you an example. There are examples in Saudi that are happening, but I want to give you an example where a country that doesn't have much resources, like Lebanon. In Lebanon, there are two programs that came out, and quickly I'll tell you. There's a program called Kafalat. Kafalat, basically, government guarantees the loans to SMEs by banks. So you go, you get certified, the bank wants to give you money, the central bank guarantees it. So you eliminate the risk. Number two, just recently, the Central Bank of Lebanon made available $400 million through banks for the technology and knowledge-based industries in Lebanon. So they basically said, we will guarantee 75% of capital that the banks give through venture capital funds to finance the knowledge industry so that we can keep our talent in Lebanon and not export it. These are great initiatives that come out from a Lebanese economy that is in real trouble.
Fantastic. The lady on my left, please.
It's not working.
Go ahead.
Good morning. I'm Munir Al-Ghamdi. I've been in the field of entrepreneurship and actually have worked with Dan on some strategic work. I'm so passionate about entrepreneurship, but what we see in the kingdom is not, it's far away from being creative chaos, because lots of efforts and lots of many companies working on entrepreneurship, many individuals working in entrepreneurship. As I see it, it's waste of efforts and resources. So what's your recommendation to foster and empower the culture of entrepreneurship in the kingdom? Thank you.
All right, Dan, that's an easy one to end up on.
Well, these are very, very, very complicated things, and they don't lend themselves easily to sound bites, but I'll give you one. Win the battle for talent, the money will follow. It's true, talent to some extent follows money, but the research all around the world shows that money capital follows talent more. So if you have to spend $1 or real, spend it on talent creation.
Yeah.
Which is education.
Jean-Luc?
Largely.
Let's go back to the educators for a moment. Jean-Luc and then Tony.
Let me answer the question from the standpoint of a president of a university. I believe that in life you win battles, you will battles one at a time. And I'm encouraging people at CARS to create a new business today, to help it grow, make it successful. To create another one the next day and try to do the same. And I encourage all of you to try to do the same at your level. Having more programs top-down likely will not change very much. It's nice to have lots of supportive organizations to talk about it, but you have to win one program at a time. And believe me, if you look at the way Silicon Valley became what it became, it didn't become suddenly what it is. You do it one program at a time. And so all of us here can have some impact if we apply ourselves, taking advantage of what exists.
Tony, and then we'll take one question from the ladies section.
Well, I think one of the comments was about the inefficiency of the process, and I think it has to be an inherently inefficient process. You just take Facebook, for example. Who could predict in advance of all the students writing social media software that Facebook would be the one that survived, that Google became the search engine? You just have to accept that you need a whole bubbling noise going on at the base, and out of that will come spikes which you can't predict, which are actually where those companies come from. So I think you have to accept it's an inherently inefficient process.
Well, I think there's also the famous example of Fred Smith, who was the founder of Federal Express, who famously wrote a term paper as a Yale University undergraduate advocating the concept of an airline for packages, and was given an F by his economics instructor. So, you know, the United States does not have a monopoly on high-quality insight in the higher education system either in terms of entrepreneurship. We're going to go to the ladies section, and then we are going to go, I think, to lunch. May we have a question from that section, please? And can you keep it brief? We are short on time. Go ahead. I see you.
Okay. My name is Hayat Sindi, a member of the Shura Council, and I'm I2 founder and CEO, I2 Institute. I want to thank the panelists for the great discussion, and I'm happy to see some of them I know. We talked about success, we talked about, you know, obstacles, and we talked about talent. But I really wanted to know from you from here, especially in this environment in Saudi Arabia, what will be the next step? Who will take the lead and make the difference? Because we're always trying to blame, not to blame or rely on someone else will take the chain. Who will take the lead to make the difference in entrepreneurship environment in Saudi Arabia?
It's a great question. Fadi?
I think the answer is very simple. It is the ultimate public-private partnership. Entrepreneurship happens in the private sector. The public sector is an enabler. It enables legislation, it enables infrastructure, it enables and makes available universities here in Saudi Arabia and in the region. So the education system married to the private sector that actually employs or actually becomes employers, creating businesses, is what needs to be done. We need, all of us across the region, we need to have a much more serious effort in a public-private partnership to foster entrepreneurship, to address the issue of job creation in the Arab world.
Okay, we're going to have to end at this point. My apologies to those of you who wish to ask a question, but were unable to do that due to time. We're going to move, very important point, we're going to move to plenary room B for the next session. The reason is that this is going to be used for lunch. So they're going to set up this room for lunch, and we're going to go down the hall to plenary B for the next session. Thank you again to all the panelists for a great conversation.